The warm spring evening in Oakland promised nothing out of the ordinary as Michelle Thompson, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher, drove home from her weekly grocery run. Her trunk was full of supplies for both her classroom and her home, where her two young children waited with their grandmother. The streetlights cast long shadows across her familiar neighborhood route, a path she'd driven hundreds of times before. But this night would change everything. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Michelle's heart rate quickened, not from guilt, but from the inherited wisdom passed down through generations of black families about police encounters. She did everything by the book, turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over in a well-lit area. Two officers approached her car, one on each side. The one at her window, Officer Richards, claimed they'd received reports of drug trafficking in the area. Before Michelle could process what was happening, the second officer, Officer Bradley, announced he'd spotted something suspicious in her back seat. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Richards ordered, his hand resting on his holster. Michelle's teacher's salary had helped her put herself through law school at night, though she'd chosen to stay in education, believing she could make a bigger difference in young lives. That legal knowledge now rang alarm bells in her mind. This stop wasn't routine, something felt deliberately wrong. The officers found a package in her car, one Michelle had never seen before. Despite her protests and requests to call her lawyer, she was handcuffed and arrested for drug possession with intent to distribute. Her mother would have to explain to her children why mommy didn't come home that night. The following weeks were a nightmare. The district attorney's office, working closely with the arresting officers, pushed for maximum charges. Michelle's reputation in the community, built over years of dedicated teaching and volunteer work, was suddenly under attack. Local news outlets ran her mugshot, and whispers spread through the school hallways. But Michelle refused to accept a plea deal, even when the prosecution dangled a reduced sentence. She knew the truth: she'd been set up. Her court-appointed defense attorney, Lisa Chen, initially urged her to take the deal, pointing out the unfortunate reality that juries often sided with police testimony. But Michelle's unwavering insistence on her innocence compelled Chen to dig deeper. What started as routine case preparation led Chen down an unexpected path. She noticed inconsistencies in the officer's report timestamps. The anonymous tip about drug trafficking came through precisely 2 minutes before Michelle's traffic stop, but cell tower data would later show the officers were already following her car at that time. Chen's investigation revealed more. Both officers had a history of complaints filed against them, particularly involving traffic stops of black drivers. Most cases had been settled quietly or dismissed, but a pattern emerged. The same language appeared in multiple reports, the same justifications for searches, the same type of evidence mysteriously discovered. As Chen built her case, she also discovered something the officers couldn't have known: Michelle's classroom had been selected to pilot a new security system just months before. The morning of her arrest, she'd been recorded spending her lunch break grading papers, at the exact time the prosecution claimed she was picking up drugs from a supplier. The story began to attract attention from civil rights organizations and local community activists. They recognized the familiar pattern: a respected community member, a questionable stop, planted evidence. But this time, something was different. This time, they had a defender who'd found the thread that would unravel everything. The preliminary hearing approached, and Michelle sat in the courtroom, her mother and children watching from the gallery. Officer Richards took the stand first, confidently reciting the story of suspicious behavior and probable cause. Officer Bradley followed, their testimonies matching perfectly, too perfectly, Chen would later argue. As the first part of this legal drama unfolded, nobody in that courtroom could have predicted the bombshell that was about to be dropped. Michelle gripped the edge of her seat, knowing that her entire future, and perhaps the future of countless others who'd faced similar injustice, hung in the balance of what would come next. Her lawyer had promised her that truth would prevail, but in a system where power often overshadowed justice, Michelle couldn't help but wonder if anyone would believe what was about to be revealed. The evidence Chen had gathered wouldn't just challenge this case. It would threaten to expose a deep-rooted conspiracy that reached far beyond a single traffic stop on a spring evening in Oakland. Attorney Lisa Chen sat in her office late into the night, surrounded by stacks of police reports and surveillance footage. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the documents spread across her desk. She'd been reviewing similar cases involving officers Richards and Bradley for the past week, and a disturbing pattern had emerged. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young clerk in the police records department, troubled by what he'd witnessed over the past year, had quietly reached out. He couldn't sleep at night, he told Chen, knowing what he knew. The clerk revealed that certain officers, including Richards and Bradley, had been accessing and altering digital records after arrests, changing timestamps, modifying report details, and in some cases, completely rewriting probable cause statements. Chen's hands trembled as she reviewed the electronic audit trails the clerk had provided. The timestamps. How'd systematic manipulation of records, always following the same pattern. But Michelle Thompson's case was different. They'd gotten sloppy this time, leaving behind digital breadcrumbs that could expose everything. Meanwhile, Michelle struggled to maintain her composure in jail. Her mother brought the children to visit twice a week, and each time, the pain of separation cut deeper. Her 6-year-old daughter asked when she'd be coming home to read bedtime stories again. Her 8-year-old son had started acting out in school, his anger at the situation spilling over into his daily life. But Michelle's resolve never wavered. During one visit, she told her mother, they picked the wrong teacher to frame. Her years of organizing classroom evidence and tracking student progress had given her an eye for detail that now proved invaluable as she worked with Chen, piecing together inconsistencies in the officers' stories. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Chen discovered a connection between recent drug arrests and a private prison corporation that had recently expanded into California. The corporation, Meridian Corrections Enterprise, had been lobbying for stricter drug laws while simultaneously offering kickbacks to departments that helped fill their facilities. A former booking officer, now working as a security guard at a local mall, came forward with more information. He described watching officers Richards and Bradley bring in multiple suspects, almost all of them black or Hispanic, with surprisingly similar arrest scenarios. The officers had a nickname around the station, the Quota Brothers. But what initially seemed like overzealous policing now appeared to be part of a larger, more sinister operation. Chen brought the evidence to her old law school mentor, retired Judge Robert Wong. As they reviewed the files in his home office, Wong's expression grew increasingly grave. This goes beyond a few corrupt officers, he said, studying the pattern of arrests and the connection to Meridian. This is systematic. And if what you're showing me is correct, Michelle Thompson's case could blow it wide open. The preliminary hearing continued, and Chen prepared to cross-examine Officer Richards. The courtroom was tense as she approached the witness stand, carrying a single manila folder. Richards maintained his composed demeanor, but Chen noticed a slight twitch in his left eye, a tell she'd observed during his direct testimony whenever he crafted a lie. Officer Richards, Chen began, her voice steady, could you please explain why your body camera was deactivated for exactly 6 minutes during Ms. Thompson's traffic stop? Richards offered a practiced response about equipment malfunction. But Chen was ready. She produced maintenance records showing his camera had been deliberately disabled 17 times in the past month, each time coinciding with arrests that led to drug charges. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Reynolds, objected vigorously, but Judge Martinez allowed the line of questioning to continue. Chen methodically laid out the pattern, the suspicious timing of anonymous tips, the disabled cameras, the identical language in multiple police reports. As Chen questioned Richards, Michelle watched the officer's confidence begin to crack. She noticed other police officers slipping into the back of the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. Was it support for their fellow officer, or were they there to witness his downfall? The real shock came when Chen presented evidence that the drug package allegedly found in Michelle's car contained traces of a unique isotope-marked coating. This coating was used by the DEA to track controlled deliveries that had gone missing from the evidence room 3 weeks before Michelle's arrest. Officer Richards's face remained stoic, but his left hand gripped the witness stand until his knuckles turned white. He glanced briefly at Officer Bradley, who sat rigid in his seat, then at someone in the back of the courtroom, a man in an expensive suit who'd been present throughout the proceedings but never spoke. The man in the suit quietly left the courtroom as Chen continued her cross-examination. Michelle later learned he was Thomas Blackwood, a senior executive at Meridian Corrections Enterprise. His hasty departure marked the moment when a simple drug frame-up began to unravel into something far more extensive than anyone had imagined. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Chen received an anonymous text message, "Parking garage. Level B2. 10 p.m. She showed it to Michelle, who gripped her hand tightly. "Be careful," Michelle whispered. "We're getting close to something big, and they know it." The pieces were falling into place, but Chen and Michelle both knew that powerful people wouldn't give up their profitable operation without a fight. As Michelle was led back to her cell that evening, she caught a glimpse of Officers Richards and Bradley in heated conversation with ADA Reynolds. Their faces showed something she'd never seen before: fear. The next day would bring even more shocking revelations, but for now, Michelle allowed herself a small smile. For the first time since her arrest, she could see a light at the end of the tunnel. But neither she nor her lawyer realized that the most dangerous part of their journey was still to come. The parking garage meeting changed everything. Chen arrived at level B2 to find not one source, but 3, a retired police sergeant named Wilson, a current evidence room technician, and a paralegal from the district attorney's office. They came with documents, thumb drives, and stories that confirmed her worst suspicions. Sergeant Wilson spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper despite the empty garage. "What's happening to Michelle Thompson isn't an isolated incident. There's a quota system in place, but it's not just about numbers anymore. It's about targeting specific demographics in specific neighborhoods. The private prison contractors give the department kickbacks for every inmate who fits their preferred profile." The evidence technician, nervously glancing around, added that she'd noticed patterns in the evidence logging system. Certain officers, including Richards and Bradley, always seem to find the same types of drugs in the same amounts. "It's too perfect. I started tracking the lot numbers. These drugs aren't coming from the streets. They're coming from our own evidence room." Meanwhile, Michelle faced her own battles behind bars. Her fellow inmates shared similar stories: traffic stops gone wrong, evidence appearing out of nowhere, pressure to take plea deals. One woman, a grandmother named Patricia, had already served 2 years for drugs she swore were planted in her car. She'd taken a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence, despite her innocence. The next morning in court, Chen arrived with reinforced security after receiving anonymous threats. Judge Martinez had also received warnings to dismiss the case, which only strengthened his resolve to see justice served. The courthouse hallways buzzed with tension as more officers than usual lingered around, some there to support their colleagues, others watching with growing concern about what might be exposed. Chen's first witness of the day was Dr. Harriet Chang, a forensic expert who had analyzed the drug package allegedly found in Michelle's car. Dr. Chang's testimony dropped the first bombshell. The fingerprints found on the package's inner layers matched those of Officer Bradley, which would be impossible if Ms. Thompson had packaged these drugs herself. The prosecutor tried to explain this away, suggesting cross-contamination during evidence collection, but Chen was prepared. She presented surveillance footage from a convenience store 2 blocks from the police station, showing Officer Bradley meeting with Thomas Blackwood from Meridian Corrections 3 days before Michelle's arrest. As this evidence was presented, Officer Bradley's composure finally cracked. He leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, who immediately requested a brief recess. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Bradley was led out, his face ashen. During the recess, Michelle's mother approached her in the courthouse hallway, tears in her eyes. "Baby, your son made something for you." She handed Michelle a carefully folded paper crane. Inside, her 8-year-old had written, "Mom, my teacher says paper cranes bring justice. I made this one for you." Michelle clutched the crane, drawing strength from her child's faith. When court resumed, Bradley's lawyer approached the bench. The courtroom fell silent as hushed discussions took place. Judge Martinez's expression darkened as he listened, occasionally glancing at Michelle. After what seemed like an eternity, he addressed the court, in light of new information. "We'll be taking a 2-hour recess. Ms. Chen, Mr. Reynolds, in my chambers." Now, what happened in those chambers would later become the stuff of legal legend. Bradley had offered to cooperate fully in exchange for consideration in sentencing. The conspiracy he described went far beyond a few corrupt officers and a private prison company. It involved judges in other districts, high-ranking police officials, and politicians who'd accepted campaign contributions in exchange for supporting stricter sentencing laws. Michelle sat in the courtroom as Chen emerged from the judge's chambers, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes gleaming with purpose. Officer Richards, watching from his seat, seemed to age years in minutes as he realized what must have happened. The paralegal who'd met Chen in the parking garage had provided another crucial piece of evidence: internal emails from Meridian Corrections discussing their target demographics and acquisition strategies, corporate euphemisms for racial profiling and false arrests. The company had even created a bonus structure for departments that helped meet their occupancy quotas. As the afternoon session began, ADA Reynolds stood up, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, in light of new evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Michelle Thompson." But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. He ordered an immediate investigation into all cases handled by Officers Richards and Bradley over the past 5 years. The dismissal of charges was just the beginning. Michelle's case had pulled on a thread that was rapidly unraveling a massive tapestry of corruption. Evidence began pouring in from other precincts, other cities, as more officers and officials came forward, either out of conscience or fear of being caught up in the growing investigation. That evening, as Michelle finally walked out of the courthouse a free woman, she was met by a crowd of supporters, families of other victims, community activists, and even some police officers who'd grown disgusted with the corruption in their ranks. Local news cameras captured her emotional reunion with her children, but they also caught something else: her quiet determination as she announced she would dedicate herself to helping others who'd been wrongly accused. But the story was far from over. As Michelle hugged her children close, Chen received another anonymous message: "Blackwood's not in custody. Files being shredded at Meridian HQ right now." The fight for justice was entering a new phase, and Michelle Thompson, teacher, mother, and now reluctant symbol of resistance, would play a crucial role in what was to come. The morning after Michelle's release, chaos erupted at Meridian Corrections Enterprise headquarters. Employees arrived to find FBI agents in the lobby, carrying boxes of documents and hard drives. But Thomas Blackwood was nowhere to be found. He'd boarded a private jet to an undisclosed location hours before the raid began. Meanwhile, Michelle faced her own challenges. Returning to her classroom brought mixed emotions. Most parents and fellow teachers welcomed her back with open arms, but a few withdrew their children from her class. The school principal, Dr. Rivera, stood firmly behind her, telling concerned parents, Mrs. Thompson's innocence wasn't just proven, she exposed a system that could have targeted any of our families. Chen worked tirelessly, coordinating with a growing team of attorneys to review hundreds of potentially compromised cases. Her office became a hub of activity, with former inmates and their families coming forward with similar stories. The evidence room technician who'd helped break the case provided a detailed list of every case where evidence handling procedures had been suspicious. One morning, Chen received a call from Patricia, the grandmother Michelle had met in jail. "They're releasing me today," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "The judge reviewed my case and found the same pattern. 2 years of my life gone, but at least I'll get to hug my grandkids again." Michelle insisted on being there when Patricia walked free, understanding better than anyone the bittersweet nature of delayed justice. The investigation expanded rapidly. Officer Bradley's cooperation opened doors that led to shocking discoveries. The conspiracy went beyond a single police department or prison company. Internal documents revealed a nationwide network of private prison corporations working with corrupt officials to maintain high incarceration rates among minority communities. Michelle's story caught the attention of national media. News vans camped outside her house, reporters asked for interviews, and social media buzzed with discussions about systematic corruption in law enforcement. But Michelle chose her platforms carefully, speaking only to journalists who focused on the broader issues rather than sensationalizing her personal drama. During a community meeting at her local church, Michelle addressed a packed room. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about every person who took a plea deal because they couldn't afford to fight. It's about every child who lost a parent to a system designed to profit from their absence. And it's about making sure this never happens again." The pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies across the state. Internal affairs departments launched investigations, and several high-ranking officers took early retirement rather than face scrutiny. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. A whistleblower inside Meridian Corrections reached out to Chen with documents showing direct payments to police department officials, carefully disguised as consulting fees. Officer Richards, seeing the writing on the wall, attempted to make his own deal with prosecutors. But his information came too late. Bradley had already provided most of the crucial details. Richards was left to face the full consequences of his actions, his testimony useful only in confirming what investigators already knew. Back in her classroom, Michelle noticed a change in how her students understood justice. During a social studies lesson about the legal system, one of her third graders raised her hand and asked, "Mrs. Thompson, is it true that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us don't tell the truth?" The question led to a thoughtful discussion about responsibility, courage, and standing up for what's right. The investigation's ripple effects reached the state capitol. Lawmakers who had accepted campaign contributions from private prison companies faced intense scrutiny. Several announced they wouldn't seek re-election. Others scrambled to distance themselves from Meridian and similar corporations, calling for reform of the private prison system. Chen's reputation grew as more cases were overturned. She began receiving calls from law firms across the country, but she remained focused on her local community. "These aren't just cases," she told her growing team of volunteer lawyers. "These are families, communities, lives that were deliberately torn apart for profit." Michelle's son, who had struggled with anger after her arrest, found a new way to channel his emotions. He started a support group for other kids with parents who'd been wrongly imprisoned. The group met weekly in the school library, sharing stories and helping each other cope with their experiences. One evening, as Michelle helped her daughter with homework, a breaking news alert flashed across her phone. Thomas Blackwood had been apprehended trying to cross the Canadian border. The carefully crafted facade of Meridian Corrections was crumbling, revealing decades of systematic exploitation and corruption. But Blackwood's arrest brought new dangers. Chen received word that several key witnesses had been approached with bribes or threats. The FBI assigned protective details to Michelle and other crucial witnesses, recognizing that powerful people still had much to lose if the full scope of the conspiracy came to light. Despite the pressure, more whistleblowers emerged. A former Meridian board member provided emails showing the company had specifically targeted communities based on demographic data, choosing locations for new facilities based on the likelihood of maintaining high occupancy rates through targeted arrests. As this phase of the investigation drew to a close, Michelle stood in her classroom after hours, looking at her students' artwork on the walls. Each piece represented a child whose view of the world had been forever changed by what happened to their teacher. But among the drawings of police cars and courtrooms, she noticed something else: pictures of people standing together, holding hands, supporting each other. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chen: "Emergency meeting tomorrow. New evidence about other companies. This is bigger than we thought." Michelle took a deep breath, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. But as she gathered her things to head home to her children, she felt stronger than ever. The system had tried to break her, but instead, she had helped break the system. The emergency meeting Chen called revealed disturbing new information. A network of 5 other private prison companies had been operating similar schemes across multiple states. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a shared database these companies used to track their success rates in different jurisdictions, a euphemism for wrongful convictions and coerced plea deals. Thomas Blackwood's arrest had triggered a race among company executives to save themselves. Some were making deals with federal prosecutors, while others were frantically destroying evidence. But they hadn't counted on the meticulous record-keeping of their own IT departments, where conscientious employees had been quietly backing up incriminating data for years. Michelle's role had evolved from victim to advocate. She started receiving letters from inmates across the country, each describing cases that mirrored her own. During her planning period at school, she carefully documented these stories, working with Chen to identify patterns that could help other cases. Her classroom became an after-hours hub for families seeking guidance on how to fight similar charges. One afternoon, a young boy arrived at her classroom with his father. "You helped my aunt get out of jail," the boy said, handing her a thank-you card. His aunt had been another victim of Officers Richards and Bradley, serving 8 months before her case was reviewed and dismissed. These moments reminded Michelle why she couldn't just return to her normal life and forget what had happened. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a former Meridian employee revealed the existence of quarterly planning meetings where company executives and local officials would discuss population management strategies. These meetings, held at luxury resorts under the guise of law enforcement conferences, were where deals were struck and quotas were set. Chen obtained the guest lists from these conferences, and the names included judges, police chiefs, and politicians from across the country. One list revealed that the judge originally assigned to Michelle's case had attended 3 such conferences. He had recused himself suddenly, citing a scheduling conflict. Now it was clear he'd recognized Michelle's name from the target lists. During a national news interview, Michelle spoke about the personal cost of these corporate schemes. They didn't just take people's freedom, they took parents from children, providers from families, teachers from students. They destroyed communities for profit, and they did it with spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations like it was just another business strategy. Her words struck a chord. Protests erupted outside private prison facilities nationwide. Shareholders began dumping their stocks in prison companies. State legislators who had previously accepted donations from these corporations scrambled to introduce reform bills. Officer Bradley's cooperation continued to prove valuable. He revealed how the department's computer system had been modified to flag certain vehicles and drivers for special attention. The system would automatically highlight cars registered in targeted neighborhoods, ensuring officers would find probable cause for stops. Michelle's son's support group for children of wrongfully imprisoned parents had grown beyond their school. Other schools in the district started similar programs, and Michelle found herself helping teachers and counselors understand how to support these traumatized children. Her daughter, inspired by the events, announced she wanted to become a lawyer, like Ms. Chen, to help people who are stuck. The investigation uncovered another shocking detail. Private prison companies had been funding research papers that inflated crime statistics in minority communities, using this manufactured data to justify increased police presence and aggressive enforcement tactics. Academic institutions that had published these studies launched their own investigations into research integrity. One evening, as Michelle graded papers, she received a call from Patricia, the grandmother she'd met in prison. Patricia had just testified before a state legislative committee about her experience. "I was scared," Patricia admitted, "but I kept thinking about how you stood your ground. You gave us all courage to speak up." The FBI's investigation expanded to include financial institutions that had processed the private prison companies' payments to corrupt officials. Bank records revealed a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts used to hide the true nature of these transactions. Several bank executives were now facing criminal charges for their role in the scheme. Chen's office had grown to accommodate the increasing workload. Pro bono lawyers from major firms offered their services, and law students volunteered to help review cases. The wall of her conference room was covered with a complex chart showing connections between companies, officials, and cases, a visual representation of systematic injustice. Michelle's classroom received an unexpected visit from the new police chief, appointed after her predecessor resigned in disgrace. The chief spoke to her students about integrity and accountability, answering their tough questions with honesty. Afterward, she asked Michelle to help develop new training programs for officers about racial bias and community trust. The evidence room technician who had helped expose the scandal was promoted to oversee a new independent evidence monitoring system. Other departments began adopting similar oversight measures, recognizing the need for checks and balances in evidence handling procedures. But not everyone celebrated these changes. Michelle and Chen received death threats from those who stood to lose power or profit. The FBI identified several attempts to hack their email accounts and phones, traced back to private security firms hired by people connected to the prison companies. During a late-night strategy session, Chen shared concerning news. Someone had approached Bradley in custody, offering him money to recant his testimony. He had declined, but the attempt suggested powerful people were getting desperate. "They're running scared," Chen observed, "but that makes them dangerous." Michelle's story had become a catalyst for national conversation about privatized prisons and systemic racism in law enforcement. Documentary filmmakers requested interviews, and civil rights organizations invited her to speak at their events. But she remained focused on her primary mission, teaching her students and helping other families fight wrongful convictions. As this phase of the struggle unfolded, Michelle received an unexpected letter. A rookie officer who had witnessed her arrest but stayed silent had written to apologize. He had since resigned from the force and was now studying to become a civil rights attorney. "Your courage changed more than just your own case," he wrote. "It changed minds and hearts." The national spotlight on private prisons intensified when a group of ethical hackers released thousands of internal emails from multiple prison corporations. These documents revealed coordinated efforts to manipulate arrest rates in minority communities across the country. Michelle spent hours reviewing these documents with Chen, recognizing patterns that matched her own experience. But the most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. A retiring judge from another state contacted Chen with information about a secret annual meeting called The Summit. At these gatherings, prison company executives would meet with selected judges and law enforcement officials to discuss population management goals. The judge provided recordings that he'd made, troubled by what he'd witnessed but afraid to come forward until now. In her classroom, Michelle noticed a change in how her students discussed current events. During a lesson about community helpers, one student asked, "How do we know which police officers are good and which ones aren't?" The question led to a thoughtful discussion about accountability and the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong. Chen's investigation faced new obstacles when key witnesses began experiencing strange accidents. The evidence room technician's car brakes mysteriously failed. The IT worker who had preserved crucial data found his home broken into. The FBI assigned additional protective details, but the message was clear: powerful people were feeling threatened. Michelle's children were also affected by the ongoing situation. Her son's school counselor reported that he'd started a journal documenting everything he saw that seemed unfair, inspired by how his mother's case had exposed systematic injustice. Her daughter had begun drawing pictures of courtroom scenes where the good guys always won. The investigation uncovered another disturbing connection. Private prison companies had been funding police equipment purchases through shell corporations. Departments that met certain performance metrics, essentially arrest quotas targeting specific demographics, received donations of new vehicles, weapons, and technology. During a community forum, Michelle shared the stage with other exonerated individuals. One man had served 12 years before evidence of his wrongful conviction emerged. Another had taken a plea deal despite his innocence, unable to risk a longer sentence. Their stories highlighted how the system was designed to pressure innocent people into pleading guilty. Officer Bradley's cooperation continued to prove invaluable. He revealed how officers were trained to use specific language in their reports that would resist legal challenges, even when describing manufactured probable cause. The training materials, created by private prison company lawyers, had been presented during paid, professional development retreats at luxury resorts. The human cost of the conspiracy became clearer as more cases were reviewed. Chen's office wall now featured a map marking each overturned conviction, each dot representing a family torn apart by corporate greed. The pattern of targeted enforcement was impossible to ignore. Neighborhoods with predominantly minority residents had been treated as resources to be harvested. Michelle's advocacy work led her to meet with state legislators. During one session, she presented evidence showing how private prison contracts had influenced local law enforcement policies. These companies weren't just housing inmates, she testified, they were creating them. They turned our communities into hunting grounds. The investigation faced a new challenge when Thomas Blackwood, now in custody, offered to reveal names of high-ranking conspirators in exchange for leniency. His testimony could implicate dozens of officials, but it would also mean easier treatment for one of the scheme's primary architects. The decision sparked heated debates about justice versus expediency. Meanwhile, Officer Richards faced his own day of reckoning. During his trial, evidence emerged that he had been grooming younger officers to participate in the scheme, teaching them how to select targets and plant evidence. His testimony revealed a systematic effort to corrupt new recruits before they could question department practices. Michelle's classroom became a symbol of resilience. Parents who had initially withdrawn their children now requested transfers back, recognizing the value of having their kids learn from someone who had fought injustice. And won. Dr. Rivera, the principal, noted that standardized test scores in Michelle's class had actually improved despite the disruption. Her students were more engaged than ever. The evidence room technician, still dealing with intimidation attempts, found unexpected support from fellow law enforcement professionals. A group of honest officers formed an unofficial protection detail, recognizing that defending whistleblowers was crucial for reforming the system. Their actions inspired others to come forward with information. Chen received an encrypted message from someone claiming to be a former prison company executive. The source revealed that similar schemes were operating in other countries, with international corporations using the same playbook to profit from mass incarceration. The conspiracy had global implications. During a late-night strategy session, Michelle and Chen discussed the broader impact of their fight. "We're not just exposing past crimes," Chen observed, "we're preventing future ones. Every corrupt officer who thinks twice, every judge who questions a suspicious case, that's progress." The investigation brought attention to other systemic issues. Review of department data revealed racial disparities in everything from traffic stops to use of force. Reform advocates used this evidence to push for comprehensive changes in police training, oversight, and accountability. Michelle's story became part of the curriculum in several law schools, used to teach students about the intersection of racial bias, corporate influence, and criminal justice. Her experience highlighted how systematic corruption could flourish when profit motives invaded law enforcement. As this phase of the investigation concluded, Michelle received news that would transform her advocacy work. A national civil rights organization offered to fund a new legal clinic specializing in wrongful conviction cases, with her and Chen serving as advisors. The clinic would provide resources for other families fighting similar battles against systemic injustice. Looking out at her classroom one afternoon, Michelle realized how much had changed. Her students now understood concepts like justice and accountability in deeply personal ways. They had watched their teacher stand against corruption and win, learning that one person's courage could spark meaningful change. The 7th month since Michelle's exoneration brought a wave of unprecedented developments. Thomas Blackwood's plea deal testimony had opened floodgates that nobody was prepared for. The former Meridian executive named 3 state governors, dozens of judges, and over 100 law enforcement officials involved in the private prison conspiracy. Federal agents were working overtime, following paper trails that stretched across decades. Michelle's kitchen table had become command central for a growing network of families fighting wrongful convictions. One evening, as she helped her children with homework, her phone buzzed constantly with messages from newly released inmates seeking guidance. Her daughter looked up from her math problems and asked, "Mom, do you ever wish you could just forget about all this and go back to normal?" Michelle pulled her close and replied, "Sometimes the right path isn't the easy one." Chen's office had expanded to 3 floors of their building, with teams of lawyers working pro bono to review cases. The wall of connections had grown so complex that they'd switched to digital mapping software. Each day brought new revelations as more whistleblowers came forward, encouraged by the mounting successes. The evidence room technician who had helped break the case received an unexpected visitor, her former supervisor, who had recently been indicted. He broke down in tears, confessing that he had wanted to expose the corruption years ago but had been threatened with frame-ups of his own family members. His testimony would prove crucial in understanding how deep the intimidation ran. Officer Bradley's cooperation led investigators to a storage facility rented under a false name. Inside, they found boxes of documents that Meridian executives had ordered destroyed, but a conscientious employee had secretly preserved them instead. The documents revealed a point system used to reward officers who met arrest quotas, with higher points assigned for arrests in targeted neighborhoods. Michelle's Son support group had grown into a nationwide network, with chapters in schools across the country. During one session, a quiet boy shared that his father had been wrongfully imprisoned for 6 years before being exonerated. "But now he's free," the boy said, "because Mrs. Thompson showed us how to fight back." The other children nodded in understanding, their shared experiences creating bonds stronger than their trauma. The investigation uncovered a sophisticated software system used by private prison companies to predict and influence incarceration rates. Data analysts who had worked on the system came forward, disturbed by how their algorithms had been manipulated to target specific communities. Their testimony sparked a national debate about the use of predictive policing technology. Chen received a series of encrypted documents from an anonymous source within another major prison corporation. The files showed that companies had been sharing resources and strategies, effectively creating a cartel dedicated to maintaining high incarceration rates. The revelation prompted new antitrust investigations at the federal level. In her classroom, Michelle used current events as teaching moments. When discussing civic responsibility, she shared age-appropriate versions of how community members had worked together to expose injustice. Her students started a project collecting stories from their own families about overcoming unfairness, creating a powerful tapestry of resilience and hope. The retiring judge's recordings from the summit meetings proved explosive. They captured casual conversations between executives and officials discussing how to ensure optimal occupancy rates through targeted enforcement. One recording included a training session on how to pressure defendants into accepting plea deals, treating human lives like inventory management. Patricia, the grandmother Michelle had met in prison, had become a powerful advocate herself. She testified before Congress about her experience, her voice unwavering as she described how the system had stolen years of her life. Her testimony, alongside Michelle's and others, led to the introduction of comprehensive reform legislation. Officer Richard's trial revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Evidence showed that officers who refused to participate in the scheme were systematically pushed out of the department through false complaints or unfavorable assignments. The testimony of these former officers painted a picture of institutional corruption that left no room for integrity. Michelle's advocacy work brought her to a national police reform conference, where she shared the stage with law enforcement officials working to change the system from within. The new police chief from her district presented their department's reforms as a model for others, including independent oversight of evidence handling and regular audits of arrest patterns. The investigation faced a new challenge when several key witnesses received coordinated threats. Photos of their children at school appeared in their email inboxes, along with messages warning them to recant their testimony. But instead of cowering, the witnesses went public, sharing the threats with media outlets and drawing attention to the desperate tactics of those still trying to protect the corrupt system. Chen discovered that private prison companies had created a shared legal defense fund, used to intimidate potential whistleblowers and finance campaigns against reform candidates. The fund's records showed millions spent on private investigators and strategic lawsuits designed to silence critics. In her neighborhood, Michelle noticed subtle changes. Officers who had once profiled residents now walked their beats differently, engaging with the community rather than hunting for arrests. Young officers would sometimes stop by her classroom to speak with students, working to rebuild trust one conversation at a time. The evidence room technician's car accident led to an unexpected breakthrough. Security cameras at a nearby business captured images of the saboteurs, linking them directly to a private security firm hired by prison company executives. The FBI arrests that followed revealed a network of hired intimidators used to silence potential whistleblowers. During a late-night strategy session, Chen shared news that would change everything. A high-ranking executive from another prison company wanted to turn state's evidence. His information would implicate not just corporate leaders and local officials, but members of Congress who had helped protect the scheme at the federal level. Michelle's daughter came home excited one day, having learned about her mother's case in social studies class at school. The curriculum now included a unit on civic responsibility and justice, using recent events to teach students about the importance of standing up for what's right. "My teacher said you're in our textbook now, Mom," she announced proudly. As the 7th month drew to a close, Michelle stood at her classroom window, watching her students at recess. A police car drove by slowly, and instead of tensing up, the children waved, and the officer waved back. It was a small moment, but it represented something profound: the possibility of change, the power of truth, and the hope that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. 1 year after Michelle Thompson's wrongful arrest, she stood before a packed courthouse again, but this time, she wasn't the defendant. She had been called to testify in the federal trial against Thomas Blackwood and other executives from multiple private prison corporations. The evidence gathered over the past year had led to one of the largest criminal conspiracy cases in recent history. The courtroom fell silent as Michelle took the stand. Behind her sat her family, Chen, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the case, former inmates freed through their investigation, whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose the truth, and community members who had supported their fight for justice. What began with a routine traffic stop, Michelle testified, exposed a system designed to profit from human suffering. But it also showed us the power of people who refuse to be broken, who stand together against injustice. Her voice remained steady as she detailed how her case had unraveled decades of systematic corruption. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The summit recordings, preserved by the retiring judge, revealed executives joking about hitting their numbers through targeted arrests. Internal emails showed how they had manipulated crime statistics to justify increased police presence in minority neighborhoods. Financial records traced millions in payments to officials who helped maintain their profitable pipeline of inmates. Officer Bradley, testifying under heavy security, provided the final pieces of the puzzle. He described how officers were trained to select targets, plant evidence, and pressure suspects into plea deals. His testimony implicated not just his former colleagues, but officials at every level of the criminal justice system who had enabled the scheme. Back in her classroom, Michelle's students had organized their own mock trial, examining questions of justice and responsibility. Their insights often surprised her. These children understood concepts of fairness and accountability with remarkable clarity. One student's comment particularly touched her. "Mrs. Thompson didn't just teach us about being brave, she showed us." The evidence room technician's car accident had led investigators to uncover a specialized team of former intelligence operatives hired by the prison companies to silence whistleblowers. Their tactics had included surveillance, intimidation, and staged accidents. The revelation of these systematic intimidation efforts strengthened the prosecution's case and led to additional charges. Chen's legal clinic had become a model for similar programs across the country. Law students worked alongside experienced attorneys, reviewing cases and helping families navigate the complex process of challenging wrongful convictions. The clinic's success rate in overturning fraudulent convictions caught the attention of national civil rights organizations. Patricia, the grandmother whose case had been overturned, started a support network for families rebuilding their lives after wrongful convictions. "The hardest part isn't just the time lost," she explained during a support group meeting, "it's learning how to trust again, how to believe in justice after the system betrayed you." Michelle's children had grown stronger through the experience. Her son's support group had expanded to 30 chapters nationwide, giving young people a space to process their experiences with the justice system. Her daughter had started a school newspaper focused on community issues, inspired by how journalism had helped expose the truth in her mother's case. The investigation's findings led to immediate reforms. Police departments across the country severed ties with private prison companies. Independent oversight committees were established to monitor evidence handling and arrest patterns. Body camera footage could no longer be selectively deactivated. But most importantly, the profit motive was being systematically removed from the criminal justice system. Officer Richards, facing sentencing for his role in the conspiracy, made a final statement to the court. His voice shook as he described how the system had gradually corrupted him, how quotas and incentives had led him to see people as targets rather than human beings. His testimony served as a warning about how institutional pressures could twist even well-meaning officers into tools of oppression. The high-ranking executive who had turned state's evidence provided crucial information about similar schemes operating internationally. His testimony sparked investigations in multiple countries, suggesting that the American private prison model had been exported globally, along with its corrupting influence on law enforcement. Michelle's story became required reading in police academies, law schools, and criminal justice programs. Training materials now included case studies on how to recognize and resist institutional pressure to engage in discriminatory practices. Her experience helped shape a new generation of law enforcement officers committed to genuine community protection rather than profit-driven policing. The federal trial concluded with guilty verdicts for all major defendants. Thomas Blackwood and other executives faced decades in prison. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized the profound impact of their crimes. "You didn't just corrupt our justice system, you betrayed the fundamental promise of equality under law." Chen received the National Civil Rights Advocate of the Year award, but during her acceptance speech, she focused on the broader movement their case had sparked. "Michelle Thompson's courage started a chain reaction," she said, "but it was the collective courage of countless others that turned one case into a movement for genuine reform." 1 year after her arrest, Michelle's classroom hosted a unique celebration. Students, parents, fellow teachers, and even some of the reform-minded officers who now patrolled their neighborhood gathered to commemorate not just her victory, but the changes it had inspired. The walls were covered with student artwork depicting scenes of justice, community, and hope. At the celebration, Michelle's daughter presented her with a handmade book titled My Mom, My Hero. Inside were stories and drawings from children whose families had been reunited because of their work. The final page read, "Sometimes the bravest thing is telling the truth, even when no one believes you." Michelle's fight for justice had transformed not just the system, but the way people understood their own power to effect change. Her case had shown that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be exposed and defeated when people stood together against injustice. As she looked out at the gathering, her students, her family, her allies in the fight for justice, Michelle realized that her wrongful arrest had set in motion something far bigger than herself. It had sparked a movement that would continue long after the headlines faded, ensuring that future generations would inherit a justice system worthy of its name.